Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again. I'm Douglas Lane, the freelance publishing manager for Zero Books, and the voice behind the Zero Books podcasts and videos. In this third installment of a video series on Noam Chomsky and his disagreement with the Slovenian psychoanalyst and quasi-Marxist Slavoj Žižek, we'll take a look at the problem of modernity. Specifically, we'll refer to the Zero Books titles Ghost of My Life, Militant Modernism, and The Last Night, in order to discover if modernity's aim to reject tradition and embrace technology, science, and reason might be taken up again during this period of despair. But before we do that, let's give one of modernity's loyal critics her due. Last month, the American novelist and grandmaster of science fiction, Ursula K Le Guin, passed away at the age of 88. She left behind many great books and a legacy of political and cultural engagement that was perhaps unrivaled in the world of American literature. So in her honor, and because I love both the book and the WNET Experimental TV Lab movie adaptation, we'll sum up a few of the problems with modernity that can be found in The Lathe of Heaven. The critic Ted Gioia, in the Journal of Conceptual Fiction, used Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven as an opportunity to point out how our modern psychoanalytic understanding makes dreams, and especially dream sequences in literature and pop culture, boring. And he compared our modern dreams to the kinds of dreams we can still find in myths and what he called traditional cultures. He wrote, "In folk tales and traditional cultures, dreams are constitutive. They might predict the future or offer sage advice. They may even create the surrounding reality. Recall that in Australian Aboriginal culture, the time of creation is known as dream time, and a whole host of beliefs and institutions, both spiritual and practical, are included under the rubric of the dreaming." A few writers of conceptual fiction have tried to bridge this gap between the modern psychoanalytic perspective on dreaming and this more mythic perspective. According to Gioia, Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven is one of those rare books that bridges the gap. The story in the book is a simple one. The main character, George Orr, is an everyman living in a dystopian future. The year is 2002, and Orr is taking pep pills in order to stop himself from dreaming. He's taking pep pills because he's convinced that when he sleeps, he sometimes has effective dreams, or dreams that change reality. When he is made to visit a psychiatrist as treatment for his drug addiction, the shrink, a man named William Haber, quickly discovers that Orr is correct. His dreams really can change reality. Haber, full of ambition, decides to use Orr in order to change the world for the better. But things quickly go terribly wrong. Le Guin's story is a kind of retelling of the German legend of Faust. It's a story that has been told and retold, written and rewritten, but one of the greatest versions of Faust was written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe is considered a great German writer. He worked in the 18th and 19th centuries and was an early critic of the Enlightenment, or of modernity. His version of Faust is a surreal morality tale in which we learn the importance of humility and the significance of faith. And Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven can be described in the same way. Her novel warns against the totalizing vision of modernity and lays bare the underside of reason. In the end, her book suggests that humanity should accept that there are mysterious forces working behind the scenes to set the world right. In Le Guin's story, she replaces Holy Scripture and God with an enlightened alien, a Beatles song, and a loyal but liberated wife. But despite these superficial differences, her novel ends with a confirmation of the world as it is, just as Goethe's Faust ended with a confirmation of the times through religious redemption. In Mark Fisher's Ghost of My Life, he began with an analysis of a different science fiction program. While The Lathe of Heaven celebrated faith, and what we might think of as a call towards humility and an appreciation of organic life, Sapphire and Steel struggled not to critique modernity, but to protect and prolong modernity's mission to act and create change. Fisher wrote, quote, "Anachronism, the slippage of discrete time periods into one another, was throughout the series the major symptom of time breaking down. In one of the earlier assignments, Steele complains that these temporal anomalies are triggered by human beings' predilection for the mixing of artifacts from different eras. In this final assignment, the anachronism has led to stasis. Time has stopped." While critics of modernity like Le Guin and Goethe worried about the dangers of modernity's totalitarian vision, proponents of modernity realized that overcoming the forces working against change might ironically require them to engage in their own perverse projects of preservation. In Owen Hatherley's Militant Modernism, he points out the irony of the contemporary modernist's position. Modernism dedicated itself to fighting the old city tooth and nail, as in the famous pronouncement in Martinetti's and St. Elia's Manifesto of Futurist Architecture. "Our houses will last less time than we do, and each generation will have to make its own." But today, those who want to preserve what remains of modernism necessarily conspire with the very people who have always opposed modernism, the heritage industries that have so much of Europe in their grip. In the sequence from permanent revolution to preservation, modernists have become quislings. And for those of you wondering when Chomsky and Žižek were going to re-enter the picture, this is that moment. If we reframe Chomsky and Žižek as modernists, we can see the difference between them as being similar to the disagreement between a hardcore modernist who wants to simply push the past into oblivion so that we can build a new world on a scientific basis, and those modernists who attempt to work dialectically, and who suggest that we think of the past as a story we tell ourselves about the world as we set about living in the present. Modernists like Chomsky, by setting up a terrain that can't be known, take the structures that define our current life as natural, or, in Chomsky's case, as biologically determined.
And by that time, Marxism does become, exactly as you say, very detrimental to this. So you get this idea, which you do find in Marx, but he couldn't have believed it, that human nature is just a historical product. And people are just malleable. They're made what their culture turns them into. You get this even in people like Gramsci, who was one of the more libertarian Marxists. But this idea that humans are simply formed by the environment and they are nothing but clay, passive clay in the hands of their molders, that's an idea which is very attractive to radical intellectuals because they think they're going to be the molders, of course, and that leads right to the Leninist version of Marxism. And it does become a kind of orthodoxy.
What's worth noting about this clip is that Chomsky switches from talking about Marx to talking about Gramsci. The main thing is that Chomsky rejects Marx's suggestion that human nature is theoretically plastic, that we are, so to speak, clay in our own hands. And Chomsky rejects Marx based on his own Kantian understanding of the world. That is, Chomsky believes that there are absolute limits to what human beings can know about the world, even if he doesn't say that he knows precisely where those limits are. While somebody like Žižek argues that those limits themselves are plastic. Žižek doesn't believe that humanity has no limits or can live without limits, but rather that we have the responsibility of determining just where those limits are. This is why Žižek doesn't believe that gender is entirely natural, even though he does think that the binary difference that we now understand as sex is inescapable. Zizek calls himself a Marxist, but he is most of all a philosopher who follows the ideas of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. A quick Google search of Lacan's theory of sexual difference might help us here. For Freud, the question of sexual difference revolved around the castration complex, that is, around whether or not someone had or didn't have a penis. For Lacan, on the other hand, castration is a symbolic process that involves the cutting off not of one's penis, but of one's jouissance, or intense enjoyment, and the recognition of lack that followed. In order to represent this lack, the subject has two possible alternatives, that of having or being the phallus. What's interesting here, and how this relates to what we've been thinking about so far, is that the difference between having and being can be mapped on to the difference between what is knowable and what simply is. The masculine position is what can be known, and the feminine position is what simply is. In Kantian terms, the feminine is the noumenal, and the masculine is phenomenal. The distinction between men and women is, according to Lacan and Žižek, historical and contingent, but the distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal is transhistorical. To understand what I mean, let's quickly reconsider the problem of perception. There's the world, and there's you, the subject. As a subject, you can see, hear, and taste what you take to be the world, but what you end up with are sensations of sight, hearing, and tasting, and not the world as it is in itself. Everything we know of the world is merely the product of our own sensory apparatus, cognitive faculties, cultural framing, emotional state, and so on and so on. These things we can know are the phenomena of our perception. What Kant called the noumenal were all the things we can't know but have to take to exist if we're going to make sense of the world. The noumenal is what's beyond the limit of our understanding. All the stuff we simply take to be out there, even though we don't know about it. It's the void, the darkness, the abyss, the world in itself and without us. To slip over into yet another register, the traditional, those things that we think of as common sense, or that must be taken just on faith, might be considered noumenal, and our scientific or instrumental reason could be understood to be phenomenological. So why is all this philosophy important? For one thing, if we fully grasp this idea, we men might finally understand women. But also, and more significantly, if we understand that this distinction is transhistorical, that the binary we think of as sex is in fact itself ontological, we can also overcome Kant's impasse. That is, we can start modernity again and embrace projects to change the world and develop a new society. We can find ourselves in Faust's position, only with something to hold on to, some sort of intellectual mooring. But where shall we begin? Why not with Federico Campagna and his book, The Last Night? In that book, he lays out how today's tradition isn't a religious one, and that what we're asked to take on faith isn't anything about angels, or how many can dance on the head of a pin, or what gender roles are proper in the eyes of God, but something else. In his book, he wrote, "Since the death of God, historical time seems to have vanished, clearing the sky above everyday life. And together with the end of history, the bundle of promises of progress has also finally run out of string. If Westerners can't live without meaning, without myths, but have had to find a way of adapting our mystical thinking to the structures of contemporary capitalism, what mantra in the heart of the global metropolis of the 21st century have we found? What other act might be able to host our obsessive spirit whilst functioning like a round magic shield, covering the frightened believers from their fear of freedom? There was only one possible, almost perfect candidate, the activity of repetition par excellence. Work. What I want to argue, hope to argue again and again in future videos, is just how work, or more precisely, work in the service of commodity production, functions as the ritual that maintains today's society. What I want to persuade you is that commodity production, or to put it in concrete terms, the production of Coca-Cola bottles, is today's Pokemon, today's ideological limit. Coca-Cola bottles, or commodities, function in the way that Žižek claimed that the Pokemon functions in part 1 of this 3-part series. That is, Coca-Cola is the object that fills in the gap in the world, and that by doing so provides what appears to be a natural limit. But what we take to be a natural place for a limit is in fact just where we presently choose for a limit to make an appearance. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. You might have noticed that Mark Fisher's Ghost of My Life, Owen Hatherley's Militant Modernism, and Federico Campagna's The Last Night are the books we featured. I want to urge you to get a hold of them online, at your local bookstore, or at your local library. They're well worth reading. Also, subscribe to this channel for more videos like this one. And if you're not a patron of our Insider podcast called Inside Zero Books, you should be.